When last we sailed with them, the Straw Hat Pirates had left the desert kingdom of Alabasta behind, a princess waving farewell from a distant dune, a new friend named Nico Robin settling quietly onto the deck. Now there were 7 of them, and the log pose that guided them across the Grand Line began, strangely, to tilt. Its needle rose, pointing not forward across the water, but straight up into the sky. It led them first to a wrecked and rusting ship that had fallen from the clouds, and to a rumor almost too absurd to believe that somewhere far above the sea there floated an island in the sky. Nami, ever the navigator, said it was impossible. Robin, who had read a great many forbidden things, said it was not. And Luffy, who had never in his life met a rumor of adventure he did not immediately love, decided on the spot that they were going to the sky, whatever anyone said. To learn how, they set a course for the one island that might hold the answer, a place called Jaya. This is the story of a liar who told the truth, a golden bell that had waited 400 years to be heard, and a rubber boy who climbed into the clouds to knock a god out of the sky. This is the Sky Island Saga. Jaya, with a lush, half-wild island, and its main port, Mocktown, was exactly the kind of place its name suggested. A rough, sun-baked pirate town full of drinkers and cutthroats and swagger. And it was here that the crew ran headlong into a certain poisonous idea that was spreading across the seas. The town's loudest son was a rising young pirate named Bellamy the hyena, a cruel, laughing brute who preached what he called the New Age. In this new age, Bellamy sneered, dreams were dead. Only fools still believed in lost cities and hidden treasures and the great romantic adventures of the old pirates. The smart pirate simply took what was in front of him and laughed at anyone who reached for something more. When Luffy and Zoro walked into his bar and openly said they were looking for a way to the Sky Island, Bellamy and his crew roared with laughter, and then they beat the 2 of them bloody, and Luffy and Zoro did not raise a hand to stop it. They let it happen. They let Bellamy take their gold and throw them out into the street, because 2 men who knew their own strength had absolutely nothing to prove to a loud fool, and a real fight would have been a waste of it. Nami was furious. Luffy only wiped the blood from his mouth and said, calmly, that people like Bellamy were not worth fighting, not yet. To the drinkers of Mocktown, it was baffling. 2 grown pirates, one of them with a real bounty already on his head, standing there and taking a beating from Bellamy's crew without lifting a single finger. It looked, on the surface, like plain cowardice, and the whole bar jeered them for it. But a few sharper eyes in that rough town understood exactly what they had just witnessed, and were quietly unsettled by it. Bellamy fought with the power of a devil fruit that made his own body springy as a coil, letting him ricochet off walls and rooftops with bone-shattering speed, and he was thoroughly used to his victims fighting back and losing. Men who simply refused to be baited at all, who bled without so much as blinking, and then stood up and walked out with their heads held high. That was a different and far more dangerous kind of strength, and some part of Mocktown knew it even as it laughed. There were 2 other travelers passing through Mocktown that day, and both of them matter far more than anyone in that bar could have known. One was a strange, jovial, enormous man with a mouthful of missing teeth, sitting alone and eating cherry pie by the fistful, a pirate named Marshall D. Teach, though the world would soon come to call him Blackbeard. He and Luffy crossed paths only for a moment, 2 strangers who did not fight and did not know each other's names. And when a mocking voice nearby laughed that dreaming was for children, it was Blackbeard who answered, with sudden and startling force, in words that Luffy would have loved if he had heard them clearly. "People's dreams," he said, "never end. Keep that man in mind, the laughing giant with the cherry pie. His road and Luffy's would cross again in fire." And Bellamy himself, it turned out, was no free agent either. He sailed under the flag of a far greater and more terrible pirate named Don Quixote do Flamingo, another name to file away quietly for the years to come. There is a strange, quiet weight to that meeting, looking back on it now. The 2 of them sat in the same rough little town, ate at the same tables, spoke of the same island in the sky. the boy who would one day be the reason that laughing giant fell, and the giant who would one day be the ruin of very nearly everything the boy loved, and neither of them felt so much as a shiver of what was coming. That is how the very largest moments in a life so often arrive, not with thunder and warning, but as a stranger across the room, eating pie by the fistful, who happens to believe, just as fiercely as you do, that a person's dreams do not ever end. Cast out of Mocktown, the crew followed a map and a hunch to a small house at the edge of the island, where they met the one man on Jaya who could actually help them reach the sky, and who carried one of the saddest and most stubborn dreams on all the seas. His name was Mont Blanc Cricket, and he lived alone but for two enormous monkey-like salvage divers, the brothers Masira and Shoujo, with whom he had formed a strange little brotherhood called the Sarayama Alliance. Cricket spent every waking hour diving to the seabed, dredging up wreckage, hunting for one thing, proof of a city of gold. The story behind that obsession was 400 years old. Cricket was the last descendant of a great explorer named Mont Blanc Noland, a brave, honest botanist and adventurer who, 4 centuries before, had sailed to this very island and found upon it a magnificent city of gold. Noland returned to his kingdom and told his king what he had seen, and the king, greedy for the gold, mounted an enormous expedition and sailed back with him to claim it. But when they arrived, the city of gold was simply gone, vanished. There was jungle, and there was ruin, but there was no gold anywhere to be found. And so Mont Blanc Noland was branded the greatest liar in the kingdom's history, put on trial, and executed, insisting to his very last breath that the gold had been real, that he had heard the island itself singing with a great golden bell. His countrymen turned his story into a mocking children's book, Liar Noland, the tale of a man who cried gold and gold and gold until no one believed a word he said. And for 400 years his descendants carried that shame like a curse. None more than Cricket, who had thrown away everything, his family and his fortune and his health, to prove that his ancestor had not been a liar. He did not even want the gold. He only wanted the truth. What none of them yet understood was the answer that had been hanging over their heads the whole time. The city of gold had not vanished. 400 years ago, a colossal upward current of the sea had struck the island and torn a piece of it, the very piece holding Noland's golden city, clean off the surface of the world and flung it up, up, up into the sky. The gold had not been a lie. It had simply gone somewhere no one thought to look. Cricket could not have known that for certain, but he had spent his whole life circling the truth of it. The diving had wrecked his body. Years of plunging to the crushing deep had left him with a diver's sickness that seized his lungs and his joints without warning, and still every day he went back down, dredging up scraps and fragments of a golden city from the black seabed, mocked by the whole world as simply the latest lying Mont Blanc. His two huge, loud, monkey-faced salvage brothers, Masira and Shoujo, loved the stubborn old man fiercely and dove at his side. And when Luffy declared, with the total, cheerful certainty he brought to everything, that they were going up into the sky itself to find the rest of that gold, something in Cricket that had been clenched shut for a very long time finally began to loosen. He threw everything he had left into readying the little Going Merry for the impossible, coding and weighting her hull, teaching the crew to hunt the wandering knock-up stream with the help of a grumpy little south bird that always, stubbornly, pointed south, pouring a whole lifetime of thwarted, ridiculed hope into one small ship and one impossible boy. And that same rare phenomenon was the crew's one road up. To reach the Sky Island, they would have to ride a knock-up stream, a monstrous vertical geyser, a column of ocean that erupts straight upward with force enough to hurl a whole ship 10,000 meters into the air. Cricket, moved by Luffy's absolute and cheerful refusal to believe anything was impossible, threw himself into helping them. He taught them to find the stream's shifting location using a stubborn little creature called a south bird, and he worked through the night to armor and prepare the little Going Merry for a launch no ship was ever meant to survive. But while they worked, Bellamy came back. The hyena and his crew raided Cricket's home, beat the exhausted old man down, and stole the small hoard of gold he had spent his whole life dredging up from the sea, the meager proof he had bled for. And this time, Luffy did not walk away. He left the preparations, marched into Mocktown alone, walked up to Bellamy in front of his whole jeering crew, and, with a single tremendous punch, laid the laughing hyena out cold on the ground in one blow. He took back Cricket's gold, said almost nothing, and walked out, leaving an entire town in stunned silence. That was Luffy's answer to the New Age, and to everyone who ever laughed at a dream, not an argument, but one quiet, devastating punch. At dawn, with the Going Merry armored and a south bird pointing the way, the crew sailed straight into the churning heart of the knock-up stream. The ocean exploded upward beneath them, a pillar of white water miles high, and the little sheep-headed ship was flung off the surface of the sea entirely and hurled screaming into the clouds. The launch itself was equal parts pure terror and pure joy. The sea drew back and gathered itself, and then erupted beneath the little ship in a roaring white pillar taller than any mountain on earth, and the Going Merry was fired off the very face of the ocean like a stone from a sling, straight up through the shrieking wind, her whole crew clinging and screaming and laughing, all at the same time. For a few endless, weightless seconds there was nothing at all beneath them, only sky and cloud and the whole blue world of the sea falling away far below, and then they burst up through the last of the mist into a light that no one from the world beneath had ever seen. Cricket and the Salvage Brothers watched them vanish upward into the clouds, and the old man, who had spent his entire life being called the descendant of a liar, allowed himself at long last to hope. They came up through the clouds into a world that should not have been possible, an ocean made of cloud, white, soft, endless, stretching in every direction beneath a bright and open sky. Islands of solid cloud drifted upon it, strange fish swam through it, and the air itself was thinner and stranger and full of wonders. This was Skypiea, the Sky Island, and to the people who lived far below on the blue sea, it was nothing but a fairy tale. The crew had sailed clean off the edge of the ordinary world. Their arrival came wrapped in rules they did not begin to understand. There was a gate set into the clouds, a heaven's gate, and a cheerful old gatekeeper who informed them that visitors were quite welcome, for a toll, and that the whole of this sky ran on customs and laws entirely its own. They were taken in by two kind and gentle Skypeans, a sweet-natured young woman named Caunus and her soft-spoken father Pagaya, who fed the lost sailors and tried, nervously, to explain to them just how dangerous a place they had wandered into. And there were wonders at every turn. Nami fell instantly and completely in love with a waver, a little one-rider wave boat driven by a dial that skimmed and leapt across the cloud sea, and she alone of all the crew could make the tricky, beautiful thing fly. But beneath every kindness in that sky ran a thin, cold current of fear, for Caunus and her father, like every soul in Skypiea, lived in constant dread of a god who was always, always listening. And the crew, in their happy ignorance, were about to break his single most sacred law without even knowing it existed. The people of the sky were a gentle folk called Skypeans, marked by small wings upon their backs, who lived on beaches of white cloud and spoke of the blue sea below as a distant heaven. Their whole civilization ran on a marvelous technology the crew had never seen. Dials, small shells that could store and release things, a breath of wind, a burst of flame, a peal of sound, the raw force of an impact, caught and kept and used again. It was beautiful, and it was peaceful, and it was also, the crew quickly learned, a land living under the boot of a tyrant. For Skypiea had a ruler who called himself simply God. His name was Enel, and 6 years earlier he had descended upon this sky with a handful of followers and conquered it, deposing its gentle old ruler and declaring himself a deity, with the power of life and death over everyone beneath him. And Enel was no mere strong man playing at godhood. He had eaten a devil fruit, the rumble fruit, which had made him a living, Logia of lightning. He could turn his entire body into electricity and move at the speed of a thunderbolt. He could call down 200 million volts at a whim. He could even stop and restart his own heart. And most frighteningly of all, he possessed a power he called mantra, the ability to hear, across great distances, the very voices of people's minds, so that he knew what everyone around him was about to do before they did it. To the people of the sky, he truly was a god, all-seeing, untouchable, and utterly without mercy. There was one more thing about that sky that mattered more than all the rest. At its heart lay a great tract of forbidden jungle called Upper Yard, which Enlil had declared the sacred land of God, forbidden to all on pain of death. But Upper Yard was not born of the sky at all. It was a piece of the blue sea island of Jaya, the very piece that had been knocked into the heavens 400 years before. Somewhere in that deadly jungle stood the ruins of Mont Blanc Noland's lost city of gold, and the great golden bell that had waited, silent, for 4 long centuries. The crew had come to the sky looking for adventure and gold. They had sailed, without knowing it, straight into the answer to a 400-year-old lie. To sail into Upper Yard uninvited, the crew quickly learned, was in the eyes of the whole sky the very gravest crime there was, trespassing on the sacred land of God, and its punishment was death by ordeal. Enlil kept 4 priests loose in that jungle, each of them a monster in his own right, and each guarding a different lethal game, an ordeal of balls that were not balls at all but homing spears of hardened cloud, an ordeal of iron, ruled by a cold swordsman named Ohm whose blade somehow struck from impossible distances, an ordeal of swamp that swallowed trespassers down into bottomless cloud, and an ordeal of string. And the jungle itself was a nightmare of sky-sized creatures, enormous birds, and a python so ancient and so vast that the Shandia had given her a name, Nola, and woven her into their darkest legends. It was here, in a brutal duel against the priest Ohm and his iron whip of a blade, that Zorro honed the steel-cutting skill he had first grasped in Alabasta, and it was here, scattered and hunted through the deadly trees, that the whole crew slowly began to understand they had blundered into a war, far older and far sadder than one tyrant's cruelty. The Straw Hats were not the only ones who wanted Upper Yard. For 400 years, a fierce tribe of sky warriors called the Shandia had waged a ceaseless war to reclaim it. For that stolen jungle was their ancestral home, the land their people had lived and died upon before it was ever torn into the sky, and upon it stood the holy bell that was, to them, the very voice of their island and their ancestors. Their leader was a grim, relentless warrior named Wiper, who fought with explosive reject dials strapped to his arm and who was willing to burn his own life to the ground if it meant taking back the sacred land. Enlil and his priests held the jungle. The Shandia threw themselves against it, generation after generation, and neither the Sky People nor the warriors could remember anymore quite why the endless war had begun, only that it could not stop. But there was a reason, buried under 400 years, and it was the very same reason that cricket wept on the sea far below. Long ago, when the Golden City still stood upon the blue sea island of Jaya, the ancestors of the Shandia had lived beside it, and their fiercest warrior had been a man named Kalgara. When the explorer Noland first came to the island, the two of them very nearly killed each other. For Noland, a doctor, had cut down the great sacred trees that were, though the tribe did not know it, the true source of a deadly fever that was ravaging their people, and to the Shandia that was the blackest sacrilege imaginable. But when the fever broke, and the people lived, Kalgara understood at last that this strange foreigner had saved every one of them, and the two warriors became sworn brothers. Noland heard then the great golden bell that was the living voice of the Shandia's island, the bond between the tribe and their ancestors, and he came to love its deep sound, and when at last he had to sail home he promised Kalgara on his honor that one day he would return. He never could. The greed of his king and then the fury of the sea that tore the whole land up into the heavens saw to that. But Kalgara never knew why his brother had failed to come back. Flung into the sky with all his people, he kept ringing that golden bell out across the clouds, waiting year after year, and he bound his descendants with a sacred oath to keep the bell ringing and to guard the sacred land with their lives until the day their brother from the blue sea finally came home. For 4 centuries, the Skypiea had been fighting and bleeding and dying to keep a promise made to a man the world below had executed as a liar, and Wiper, their grim and relentless leader, was Kalgara's own blood, still keeping the oath, still guarding the bell, still waiting, without quite knowing it, for that 400-year-old bell to ring. Into this old and bloody standoff blundered 7 pirates who only wanted to sightsee and maybe find some gold. And Upper Yard was a nightmare. It was a jungle of monstrous sky-sized beasts and drifting cloud, patrolled by Enel's 4 priests, each of whom ran a deadly ordeal. A lethal game of iron, or string, or swamp, or spheres, designed to kill any trespasser who dared set foot on God's land. The crew was scattered and hunted through the trees. And presiding over all of it, bored and amused, was Enel himself, who announced to everyone caught in the jungle that he was beginning a survival game, by his divine calculation of all the many people now upon Upper Yard, his priests, the Skypiea, the pirates, and the gentle deposed old ruler. Only 5 would still be alive when the night was through. He said it the way a man reads a weather forecast. He had already seen it, he told them, with his all-hearing power, and then he set about making it true. What followed was a long and frightening night. The crew was broken apart across that deadly jungle. Luffy and a few of the others swallowed whole by an ordeal. Nami and Chopper and the ship menaced through the dark by the priests and by the ancient giant snake Nola, and Robin slipping quietly away on her own to search the old ruins for the secrets that she, alone in all the world, could read. Enel toyed with every one of them from on high, picking off the fighters one by one exactly as he had foretold, his terrible count of survivors ticking steadily downward as the hours wore on. And the good old Sky Knight, Gonfall, riding his great steed Pierre through the clouds, did what little he could to shield the scattered crew, a single decent man standing against a god for no better reason than that someone had to. They found one friend in that jungle, at least. The kind old man the crew had met before, riding a great steed through the clouds, a gentle, weathered knight named Ganfall, turned out to be the true former ruler of Skypiea, the good god whom Enel had overthrown, now living quietly as a wandering sky knight and doing what small good he could. He fought at their side. But even with his help, the crew was hopelessly outmatched. Enel's power was very nearly absolute. His mantra let him dodge every attack before it was thrown, and his lightning could reduce a warrior to ash in an instant. One by one, the mightiest fighters in the sky, the Skypiea's Wiper, Enel's own priests, the Sky Knight, and the Straw Hats themselves, were struck down. It began to seem as though the false god truly was invincible, and that his terrible prophecy of 5 survivors would come to pass exactly as he had foreseen. And yet, in the corners of that long night, the prophecy kept quietly fraying. The crew simply would not stay down the way a god expected people to. Zoro carved a path clean through the swordsman priest Ohm and his whip of living iron. Nami and Chopper and the others outran and outwitted horrors far above their weight, and, most surprising of all, the 2 oldest enemies of that sky, the Skypiea and these intruding pirates, found themselves in the end, fighting side by side, warrior and outlaw together, against the one god who meant to erase them both. Enel could hear every plan the very instant it was formed. But there was one thing his all-hearing mantra could not catch and could not counter: the sheer, dumb, magnificent stubbornness of people who flatly refused to accept the ending he had already written for them. But Enel, for all his all-hearing power, had made one single, fatal miscalculation. He had never in his life met a man made of rubber. Here was the one thing in all the sky that the god of thunder could not do. He could not electrocute Luffy. Lightning, the whole of Enel's terrible power, simply passed harmlessly through a body made of rubber, doing nothing at all. 200 million volts, and Luffy just blinked at him, unbothered and unhurt. For the first time in 6 years, the god who could hear every mind and dodge every blow was face to face with an enemy he could not kill and could not even properly hurt. Enlil's serene, godly calm began, slowly, to crack. By now, the false god had tired of his sky entirely. Enlil had never truly wanted to rule Skypiea, he wanted to leave it. He dreamed of a place he called the Fairy Earth, an endless, boundless land beyond the clouds, up where the moon hung, and he had built a colossal flying ark, a ship of cloud and lightning called the Maxim, to carry him there. But he would not go quietly. Before he ascended, Enlil meant to erase Skypiea completely, to gather all the clouds of the sky into a single, monstrous thunderhead and drop it upon the island in one apocalyptic blast, wiping the Sky People and the Skypiea and 400 years of war off the map together so that he might leave. Behind him, nothing but empty blue. He climbed aboard his rising ark, the doomsday cloud gathering above him, and began to lift away from the dying island toward the moon. He did not do it alone, and he did not do it gently. Enlil's mantra let him hear the mind of very nearly every soul in that sky, so that he moved through all the chaos and the war like a man calmly reading a book whose ending he already knew, striking down the Skypiea's wiper and his own treacherous priests and anyone else who so much as annoyed him, all with the same bored, serene, godly smile. He even forced poor Naomi, the one person alive who could truly fly a waver, to carry him up to his ark at gunpoint. And high above the whole island he assembled his terrible masterwork, a single, monstrous, ever-swelling thundercloud he had named the Rygo, a floating engine of raw lightning fast enough to swallow the sky, which he intended to drop upon the whole of Skypiea in one final, deafening, world-ending peal of thunder. To Enlil, it was not even an act of cruelty. It was simply tidying up, clearing away one small, tiresome world on his way to a better one. And Luffy went up after him. Clinging to the great ark as it rose, the rubber boy fought the god of lightning through the clouds, and slowly, impossibly, began to win. It was a strange and desperate climb of a battle, the two of them tearing through the varied guts of a flying thunder ark as it rose toward the moon. The serene god who had never once in 6 years been so much as touched, and the grinning boy whose every weapon he simply could not feel. And Luffy was fighting for something more now than his own life. The fallen Skypiea warrior Wiper had told him, before he went down, about the bell. The great golden bell that his people had sworn for 400 years to make ring out once more. And Luffy, being entirely Luffy, had promptly and cheerfully decided that he was going to ring it himself, right in this smug god's face, and end 4 centuries of silence with a single almighty toll. Enlil struck him with everything he had, and none of it touched him. And with every wasted, roaring bolt, the god's serene certainty cracked a little further apart. He had spent 6 long years never once being touched, never once being made to feel fear, and now here was a boy who took 200 million volts full in the chest and only grinned, and picked himself up and asked if that was really all a god could do. By the time Luffy finally cornered him in the heart of the shattering arc, it was Enlil, the god of the sky, the man who could hear the very future, who looked, for the first time in his whole life, genuinely and helplessly afraid. And when Luffy finally cornered him, he reached out and seized an enormous ball of solid gold, a huge golden orb from the ruins of the old city, and wound his rubber arm back around it and drove that colossal golden fist with the whole weight of his fury behind it straight into the god of the sky. The blow was so vast it cracked the ark apart, and it hurled Enlil at last into the one thing left standing in that ancient place, the great golden belfry, the 400-year-old bell of Mont Blanc Nolan's lost city. And a bell rang. Its sound was enormous, a deep, golden, endless toll that rolled out across the whole of the sky, over the cloud sea, through the drifting islands, down through the mist, and down, all the way to the blue sea far below. On that distant ocean, 400 years after the last soul had heard it, Mont Blanc Cricket and the Salvage Brothers, And all the pirates of Mocktown and everyone on the island of Jaya went utterly still, and lifted their faces to the sky, as a great golden bell they had all been told was. Nothing but a dead man's lie told clear and true across the heavens. In that moment the whole world knew without a shadow of a doubt that the City of Gold had been real, that the bell had been real, that Mont Blanc Noland, dead and disgraced for 4 centuries, had told the truth every single day of his life. Cricket, who had thrown away everything he had to clear a liar's name, stood on the deck of his little salvage ship with tears streaming down his face and listened to the sound of the island of gold ringing out of the sky. The proof he had spent his whole life diving for, falling, now, freely, out of the heavens onto everyone at once. His ancestor was not a liar, he never had been. And high up in the sky, the Shandia heard it too. Viper? Kalgara's own blood, the grim warrior who had poured his entire life and every last drop of his strength into keeping a 400-year-old promise he could barely explain, heard the great golden bell of his ancestors ring out across the clouds at last, the very sound his people had. Sworn, generation after generation, to keep alive until their brother from the blue sea returned. And the long, bone-deep, exhausted grief of 4 whole centuries finally, at last, began to lift. The promise had been kept. The brother had, in the end, and in his own strange roundabout way, come home. And the bell that old Kalgara had rung and rung into an empty sky, waiting for so many long years, was ringing still. And this time, from the sea below and the sky above at once, it was answered. Anil was finished, blasted out of the sky by the golden fist of a boy who had never once believed a god could not be beaten. His great thundercloud came to nothing, his ark broke apart, and the false god, defeated and alone, drifted off at last toward the empty moon he had dreamed of and out of the story. And with him gone, the 400-year war ended too. The Shandia and the Skypians, both of them survivors of the same long grief, laid down their weapons at last, and the sacred land, the land they called Verth, the precious soil that meant more in the sky than any gold, was finally shared and finally at peace. The gentle old sky knight, Ganfall, took up the quiet care of his sky once more, not as a god this time, and not as a king, but simply as a good and weathered man looking after his neighbors. The Skypians and the Shandia, who had never truly been enemies at all, only 2 grieving halves of a single very old wound, began the slow and clumsy and hopeful work of becoming one people again. And the crew, for their part, had well and truly earned a night of feasting and laughter beneath the stars of a world that not one soul on the blue sea below would ever believe they had seen with their own eyes. There was one last discovery in the ruins of the Golden City, and it may be the largest thing in this whole story, though it was spoken very softly. While the others celebrated, Nico Robin wandered the old belfry and found, set into the great golden bell, a poneglyph, one of those ancient stones of forbidden history that she alone in all the world could read. But this one was different. Beside the ancient script, someone had carved a second message in a different hand, a message left by a pirate who had climbed to this same sky long ago and stood in this same ruined place. It was signed by Goldie Roger, the king of the pirates himself. Roger had been here. Roger had read this stone and left his own words upon it on his way to the end of the world. Robin said very little about what she had found, but she understood, now, that the scattered stones she had spent her whole life hunting were pieces of a single enormous secret, and that the man who had conquered the Grand Line had been following the very same trail long before any of them were born. It was a thread that ran from the top of the sky all the way down to the treasure at the end of everything, and Robin quietly tucked it away in her heart. For anyone who understood what she was looking at, it was staggering. The poneglyphs had been scattered across the whole of the world for the very purpose that their forbidden history could never be gathered and read by any single soul. And yet here was proof that one crew, Roger's crew, had already found them, one by one, climbed even into the clouds to read this. One, and left a message behind for whoever might one day follow. It meant that the road to the very end of the Grand Line, to the last island, and the great treasure waiting upon it lay written across these ancient stones. And it meant that Robin, the last living person able to read them, might one day be the only soul in all the world capable of walking that road to its end. She said nothing of this to the others. But something in her, quietly, on that day in the sky began to change. For the crew, though, the sky had given them everything a sky island could. They had found their adventure and their impossible gold, and a good deal of it went into the ship's hold for the road ahead. And when it was time to go, they left the way you leave a dream, gently and downward. Riding a vast cloud-filling creature back through the white sea, the 7 of them, laughing and battered and rich, dropped down out of the heavens and fell, at last, back onto the ordinary blue ocean of the world below, the sky island already turning to a fairy tale behind them. They left the gentle Skypians and the reconciled Shandia waving from the clouds, and sweet Canis, who had found a quiet courage of her own during that long and terrible night, saw them off with tears and a smile. The little going Mary, battered now by everything that both the Grand Line and the sky had thrown at her, carried them down, a good deal more worn than she had been, and creaking, if anyone had listened closely enough, in a way that a careful ear might have begun to worry about. But that trouble was for another day, for now there was only the long, gentle fall back down into the blue, and the sound of a golden bell still ringing out somewhere far above and behind them, across a sky that no one below would ever believe. And that is where we will leave them for tonight, a false god drifting off toward his empty moon, 2 peoples at peace at last over the land they had bled for, and far below on a blue sea, an old man weeping for joy beneath a golden sound, because the ancestor the whole world had called a liar had finally, after 400 years, been proven true. Let's take a slow breath together and think on what that sky gave them. A town full of people who had decided that dreaming was for fools, and a single quiet punch that answered them. A liar who was not a liar, and a bell that waited 4 centuries to say so. A god who could hear every thought in the world undone by the one man whose body simply laughed off lightning, and a message on an ancient stone carved by a dead king that whispered how very far this journey still had to go. There is something in Nolan's story worth carrying with you as you drift off, that the things the world is quickest to call impossible, and the dreams it is quickest to call lies, have a way, given enough time and enough stubbornness, of turning out to be true. The great shipwright sitting on the water, the friends and the betrayal still waiting there, and the terrible secret of Nico Robin's own past, all of that lies ahead of us in the chapters yet to come. But there is no need at all to rush toward any of it now. For tonight, simply let the little ship sail on, back on the calm blue sea beneath a wide and quiet sky, a crew of 7 dreamers a little richer and a little wiser, carried softly forward by the very same old promise. Rest easy. The Grand Line will still be there, waiting when you wake.